It's the first Sunday of the month, and if we were not living in the midst of Corona tide, we'd be celebrating Holy Communion together. It's always been kind of a fun thing for me as a pastor to see how different congregations celebrate Holy Communion together differently, because for everybody, it's a really special time. And it's also formative for our lives collectively as a church, but also individually as Christians. And it's no coincidence that every denomination thinks that they have the market cornered on fellowship meals and potlucks. I actually remember when I was preparing for ordained ministry, and I figured out that my obsessive love for food and cooking and throwing dinner parties actually was an asset. And I have to confess that in every church I've served, I have managed to use some small group or Bible study that I was leading an excuse to actually just have people over for dinner. And the thing is, that's been good praxis. Food, and maybe more importantly, eating together, really is fundamental and foundational to who we are and what we've always done as Jesus followers. Now, it's possible that the early church used this story that we read this morning of Jesus essentially having a giant dinner party as part of their celebration of the Eucharist. And I love that. I love it because it expands this holy meal from just being centered on the Last Supper and the looming passion of Jesus, which is what we normally learn and hear about, to also incorporating this miraculous act of abundance and care and new community. Now, if you think to when we celebrate Holy Communion in church, the pastor always reenacts, like with actual physical movements with our hands, Jesus taking the bread, blessing it, breaking it, and then finally giving it to the disciples. And so those four actions, take, bless, break, and give, are a clue whenever we see them in the Gospels that this particular action, whatever is happening, is related to the Eucharist, or another example of it, or is meant to add to its meaning. So in this story of the loaves and the fishes, or the feeding of the 5,000, whichever way you want to name it, Jesus uses that same formulation with the crowds here. He takes the bread, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives it to the disciples, and then they give it to the crowds. For many Christians, the meaning of Holy Communion is just about remembering when Jesus did that action of taking, blessing, breaking, and giving in the Last Supper, and the way that he told people that it was to remember him with prior to his death on a cross. Now that's just a memorial meaning. But when we as United Methodists celebrate Holy Communion, we aren't only remembering Jesus' death or the Last Supper. That's part of the meaning, but it's not the whole meaning. We're also celebrating all that God has done for us throughout human history. We're acknowledging the work specifically done through Jesus' life and death and resurrection. We're practicing gathering together at God's great feast where everyone has a place. And we're also looking forward to this new kingdom where there's abundance and inclusion and care. Part of our practice of Holy Communion is also that we want it to change us. We want it to shape us. We want to be reminded of God's goodness and presence in all the little ordinary things in life, like bread. We also want to start acting out in the rest of our lives, outside of Sunday morning, outside of the church, the way we say things ought to be when we're all gathered together at that table at God's great feast. And we also want our lives to become ways that other people encounter Christ. We want our lives to be sacramental. We want them to be lives where people can taste and see that the Lord is good through just knowing us. So if we think of Holy Communion or the Eucharist as being about more than just Jesus' death and understand it more as a practice to look for God's action and then be shaped to go do God's work, then it makes a little more sense that this story of Jesus miraculously feeding a huge crowd would be part of a celebration of God's alternative way of being, of the kingdom of heaven, of all the things that we celebrate in Holy Communion. In this story, we see the kingdom acted out. We see what this new way looks like in a really basic practice. And we also see how this kingdom way that Jesus is now demonstrating instead of just teaching about is, in fact, really different than the way that we've been doing things. This story comes immediately after, and actually in response to, the bad actions of the earthly king of that time, Herod. And that's on purpose, to draw our attention to the contrast between Jesus, the one proclaiming that the kingdom of heaven is here, and Herod, the king installed by Rome. So this is the first 12 verses of chapter 14. And what happens in that section is basically a flashback. And Jesus finds out that Herod has had John the Baptist put to death for his subversive prophetic message, and also for his exposure of Herod's family's own corruption. And Jesus hears that it happened at a dinner party, at a birthday celebration that Herod was throwing publicly for the guests. And when Jesus hears about it, his first response is to withdraw, to pray alone. But then to react to this crowd not with suspicion and hostility, and certainly not with the force that the Roman Empire might use, but instead with deep compassion and with care. And so it's in this act of feeding the crowd, and in the contrast between Rome, that we see beyond just a parable teaching what the actions inside God's alternative kingdom look like. First, the thing we see is that within this kingdom, there is abundance. In contrast to the empire, which controls people using fear and scarcity, God's kingdom has plenty enough for all. In fact, there's so much that there are leftovers. And this abundance is realized when hoarding and greed are put aside and people share what they have for the greater good, for the good of all. This isn't just about taking care of our own communities or our own families. This is an abundance that doesn't have boundaries attached to it. There's not hierarchy on who is more deserving. There's no application to make sure you really need some of those loaves and fishes. It's just abundance, poured out and shared. We also see that in this miracle, Jesus creates an alternative community in this crowd. Now, by alternative community, I just mean a community of people that's got something in common, that's defined by something different than what our usual groupings of people might be. Things like your geography or proximity to one another, your neighborhood, or your ethnicity, or the family that you come from, or even your citizenship status. So alternative community is just belonging outside of the cultural norms. Now, within the Roman Empire, your identity provided safety, especially if you held Roman citizenship. Even being identified with a certain ethnic group might make you more or less respectable or more or less subject to Roman overreach and abuse of power. And then even within ethnic groups, there was certainly a hierarchy. And we see Jesus challenging these hierarchies and these barriers of who belongs and who doesn't so often based on who he associates with and who he calls blessed. Jesus is always finding himself with the outsiders. So in this story, the inclusion of the masses being cared for without respect to clan or creed or respectability or religiosity is a new community. It's not based on citizenship or family or where you came from or how much money you have or any other factor that might create division otherwise. We know that many of these people in this crowd are sick, which may have made them outcasts depending on the nature of their illness, and they certainly were in a place of utter desperation to have followed Jesus this far out into the wilderness. So this new community, if it has anything in common, it's not their security and sense of belonging. It's that they are beyond what any other structure of belonging and care has been able to do for them. And this alternative community exists out in the wilderness, out where life is supposed to be difficult, because it isn't contained within the structures that we build to provide and care for ourselves. This is a community of people who are outside social structures, outside labels, outside respectability, outside neighborhoods, outside all the things that we do and create to say that this here is mine and that over there is yours, and what is yours is not my problem. And yet this outside, outcast, out of options new community is gathered together and cared for by Jesus, not because of what they have or who they are, but because of what they are seeking, because of their shared need. What to any other system of belonging would be seen as a liability is actually a root, is actually the basis of this new kingdom. And rather than Jesus greeting that need with disdain or maybe even exhaustion, Jesus sees these people with compassion and is moved to act. Even though he's trying to find some solitude and some peace to go away and pray, Jesus is still moved in the core of his being to feel with these people. It's an experience of solidarity, not of pity. And even the disciples miss this part, because they want to send the crowd away when it's clear that this gathering is not going to break up by supper time. But instead of shrugging his shoulders or giving in to the honestly pretty logical concerns of the disciples, Jesus instead sends the disciples out to be servants. Contrast this response to the feast that Herod has thrown for just a few. The act of brutality in John's beheading that happens there, and the fear that Herod lives with and is controlled by. Whereas this earthly king operates out of self-preservation and self-indulgence and self-enrichment, the king of this new way is moved by compassion, by seeing and meeting the needs of so many. It's powerful to see these stark contrasts between the earthly empire of Jesus' day, the one where Herod is the king, and the kingdom of heaven that he is living out of in his actions. And really, our call is to live out this kingdom too, to be formed so that people see the kingdom coming into being by how we love others and give of what we have been given. To live sacramentally, to live so that people see Christ in us, is to live a life that brings us into sharp contrast and conflict with the empires of our world. When we live sacramentally, when our very lives take the kingdom of heaven into this world, we should be engaging in the same kind of resistance as Jesus' miraculous feeding. We will be living out sacramental resistance when we follow his example. When we take what we are and what we have, when we consecrate it to God's work and purpose, when we let ourselves be broken open and then given in loving service to others, we are resisting all the other forces in the world that tell us to live in fear, to celebrate greed, to protect only our own, to believe there isn't enough, to hate, to hoard, to divide, to ignore. If we believe that there is abundance in God's provision when we are gathered together, then we are pushing back against the economy of scarcity that says there isn't enough if you don't hold on to what's yours. If we give freely from God's abundance, regardless of how little we think we have, then we are resisting the notion that self-reliance is true strength. If we believe that God's kingdom leads us to alternative community, then we're pushing back against all the false divisions that keep us from caring for each other. If we act like we are actually interconnected no matter what, we're resisting the definitions of family and respectability and worthiness that have always left some behind. If we believe that God's kingdom requires compassion, then we are pushing back against the indifference upon which is built the oppression of many. If we treat others with compassion, seeing the way that Jesus sees, and having eyes that are moved to do something, then we are resisting the apathy that allows evil to flourish. Sacramental resistance is taking the ordinary and noticing not only how God uses it to point us towards a more profound and holier reality, but how that new reality stands in opposition to the forces that destroy and abandon and reject. The place where I am seeing this kind of sacramental resistance most evidently, most obviously right now in our community is with mutual aid groups. Networks of people that help just because help is needed, that don't evaluate worthiness, that accept and celebrate whatever small gift can be given, that create an alternative community for those who get left out of the structures and systems that are supposed to provide support and stability. I know that many of y'all have been involved with this kind of work already, either through the Athens Mutual Aid Network or through Fondo Solidario de Emergencia. We're all aware already that the reality for a lot of our neighbors in Athens is that they are living on the edge. That the systems that are supposed to create community and belonging, the systems that promised abundance, the systems that promised to care, have failed. And when we look at those problems, if we just look at poverty alone, just on the systemic level, these problems seem too big. They seem like more than we can even start to address. But if we're practicing sacramental resistance, if we believe that in the act of providing aid, even for just one person, even of just giving a little of what we have, even of just caring for one person, the person right in front of us, even for seeing our interconnectedness with each other. When we do those things, when we practice that kind of resistance, those acts are of consequence. And they are holy. And they are building the kingdom of heaven here. So this is your charge for the week. Check out some form of mutual aid. Whether it's one of the two groups that I mentioned that are here, or maybe something else. Take what you have. Bless it. Give it. Be broken open. Give a little bit of what you have, whether it's money or your talents or your time. And in that gift, in that giving, in that act of sacramental resistance, notice how Christ is present and how the kingdom of heaven is at hand.